converted B-17 transport plane carrying 41 US passengers and crew takes off into a foggy Queensland dawn. But a catastrophe is about to happen. For 2 minutes, the great plane struggles to climb. It's clearly in trouble, and as it tries to return to the airfield, it plunges into a mangrove forest, killing all but one on board. One lucky survivor somehow manages to walk away from the burning wreckage, but 40 others lay dead, leaving heartbroken families thousands of miles away in America.
It's sad to think what happened to him. It was a family loss that no one ever got over.
To worsen their grief, the authorities hush up the details of the crash, and the family's inquiries are met by a wall of silence.
My parents had received a telegram, and all it says was that he was killed in the South Pacific. There wasn't any detail whatsoever.
Witnesses are silenced.
They told us to be quiet. Don't talk about it, you know.
The Baker's Creek crash was the worst aviation disaster in Australian history, but its cause remains a mystery. Was it engine trouble? Was the plane too heavy? And has a young pilot been wrongly blamed for the tragedy for the last 70 years?
It was a perfect storm in terms of what caused that crash. Everything that could possibly go wrong was there.
Could an accident like the Baker's Creek disaster happen today?
It's still possible for a crew to mismanage a basic situation.
Can World War II air crash detective Garth Barnard follow a trail of clues across 2 continents and finally solve the mystery of the Baker's Creek crash?
The bit that's caught my eye is they were actually given the cause of the crash.
For the past 20 years, Garth Barnard has been investigating UK World War II air crashes. But today he's on the trail of the Australian Baker's Creek disaster.
Until recently, I hadn't even heard of the B-17 crash at Baker's Creek. It was the biggest crash in Australian aviation history. And few people in Australia even know about it or even what happened. The uncertainty about the cause, the mystery that surrounds it, just makes me want to find out more.
In the foggy pre-dawn light is US pilot First Lieutenant Vern J. Gidcombe and his co-pilot, Flight Officer William C. Erb, went through their pre-flight checks. 35 American personnel began to board an obsolete B-17 bomber that had been converted into a troop carrier.
It had flown so much in combat and had been patched up so many times that the ground crew affectionately referred to it as Old Miss EMF, which stood for Every Morning Fix It. According to one of the crew chiefs, for every 10 hours of flying, it took 10 hours of repair.
They were on their way back from a welcome period of rest and recuperation in Australia, far away from the horrors of the war in the Southwest Pacific. After boarding, they tried to make themselves as comfortable as possible on the makeshift plywood floor of the plane. The flight was going to take the mixed services contingent of men from the pretty Queensland town of Mackay on a 4.5-hour flight to Port Moresby in New Guinea, where they would return to their frontline duties. Checking his maps and charts at his table in the nose of the aircraft was Navigator Second Lieutenant Jack Ogren.
My brother, he was a very meticulous type of person. He was well-groomed, and he did well in high school. But he was, I thought, a really, really swell person.
Also on board was Staff Sergeant Frankie Welshel. As part of the 6-man crew, he had volunteered for the flight as a replacement for its usual crew chief.
He was scheduled to come back to the United States and had one more flight that he needed to take in order to get his flight pay. And he took the flight because it was the last flight before he was to have left.
Last to climb aboard was Corporal Foy K. Roberts. As the final man to embark, he joined the huddle of passengers sitting toboggan style at the feet of the radio operator near the middle of the plane. The flight was now ready to leave, and the loading officer, Captain Samuel Cutler, closed the rear door of the aircraft. Because of poor weather, their departure was delayed by 30 minutes to allow the fog to clear. But at precisely 6 a.m., Gidcombe eased back the throttles and the 4 engines of the B-17 powered the heavy plane up into the sky. The flight plan took the plane on 2 left turns and then back over the airfield to fix its position before heading northwards toward Port Moresby. 2 minutes into the flight, and with the aircraft only a few hundred feet off the ground, Gidcombe successfully made the first of the 2 90-degree turns. But as he completed the second turn, something went wrong. Suddenly, the great plane fell from the sky and crashed into the trees, bursting into flames. All on board were killed. All, that is, apart from Corporal Foy Roberts, who had somehow miraculously survived.
It seems amazing to me that a crash of this magnitude has left such little evidence behind. I mean, why is that? Where has all the information gone? I mean, has it been hidden over time, or because of the confusion of the war, it wasn't stored correctly, or has there been some sort of attempt to cover it up, or I don't know, this just seems to be kept under wraps, sort of a secret, but I'm determined to find out more.
Garth begins his investigation by meeting Robert Cutler. Together with colleagues in Australia, Cutler has created the Bakers Creek Memorial Association, which aims to honour the victims of the tragedy and to track down surviving relatives. Robert's father was Captain Samuel Cutler, the officer who supervised the loading of the flight that morning. It was a wartime diary extract that sparked Robert's interest into the Bakers Creek disaster.
What a day, and a tragic one. At 6:02 a.m., 2 minutes after I turned my back on the CBA plane that I had seen just yesterday, it crashed into some woods 5 miles away and exploded, killing 40 people, with only 1 saved. Pilot error and poor visibility. As the officer of the day, I put the men on the ship, and so I had a direct part in sealing their fate. Also, I was at the scene of the crash and saw mangled bodies, killed while flying at 200 miles an hour. Terrible.
How does that make you feel?
Well, it was incredible. This is the first time I knew the details of it. When he came back from the war, he didn't talk much about it. He came back 3 years later after this crash, and other things were going on. He was haunted by this notion of closing the door and sealing their fate.
Although brief, this is the first account Garth has seen that confirms the time, place, and scale of the accident. But it's not the only piece of evidence Robert has unearthed among his father's possessions.
As I understand it from my dad's other papers, 2 of the men were brought there with military escorts. They were AWOL. And so he had to take 1 guy off the plane to make room for 1 more guy to go on the plane. And on the manifest, which you see over here, this is crossed out in pencil. This fellow here, Gilpatrick, was taken off the plane, and another guy was put on, added in pencil. This other fellow, Franklin Smith Jr. This is an official document called an Air Transport Manifest, which my father had to sign as the officer of the day, but it lists all the names of the passengers and the crew members.
For Garth, this document holds the first tantalizing clue in his investigation. The gross weight recorded for takeoff was 46,810 pounds. Boeing, the plane's manufacturer, clearly stated a weight safety limit of 47,500 pounds for the B-17C model. It wasn't overloaded, but the manifest proves that the plane was very near to its weight limit. Could that have contributed to the disaster? Before he travels to Australia, Garth wants to discover more about those who died. First, he has to find their families. For many years, researcher C.K. Gailey has worked closely with the Bakers Creek Memorial Association to track down relatives and to tell them more about how their loved ones died.
They were exceedingly grateful to find out what happened to their loved one. It's basically giving the family the details of what happened, and being able to do that is a real satisfying thing to do.
Using sources such as census information, CK and his colleague, Teddy Hanks, managed to find 38 Bakers Creek relatives, but they were unable to trace the family of navigator Jack Ogren. Enter the age of the internet.
Tried to find somebody named Wayne Ogren. I just, in desperation, I put him into the search engine, Google. I just put the name in to see what would happen. And sure enough, years earlier, he had sent an email to a website. And so I sent an email to his email, and I basically said, "Are you the brother of Jack Ogren, who died in World War II?" And it couldn't have been, he had to have been on his computer, because it wasn't 15 minutes, and he came back and he said, "Why, yes, I am."
CK traced Jack's brother Wayne to Georgia. Garth followed the trail to find out what Wayne remembers about his brother.
Of course, it was a real shock when this happened, and all we heard was, at the time, was a telegram. No information, just that he was killed in the South Pacific, I think it said. I found it really hard to accept that. I couldn't believe it, really. And yet I knew it was true, but, it was just, didn't want to think about that,
Determined to find out more about how her son died, Wayne and Jack's mother had desperately sought answers.
And so she connected with some fella about, trying to find out what exactly happened. Well, during the war, this fella that was over there when Jack was, couldn't say very much. So there's two letters that I have, one when he was still over there, and then one after he came back to Texas. And of course, the letter that came from Texas after he was back in the States, it wasn't censored so much at all, maybe. And so the second letter was, told more. She wanted to find out, what really happened. And she did find out some. To me, it was the most wonderful thing that could have happened with finding out more about my brother.
The letters Jack's mother received related the events of that morning, but their author gave no information about the cause. However, at least one other Bakers Creek family was able to discover more. It was that of Staff Sergeant Frank Welshel. Peggy Estes reveals how her family was able to find out more details about the fate of her uncle.
I had an uncle who was in Port Moresby waiting for this flight because he knew my uncle was coming in. They had communicated and he knew he was going to be coming in. So he was aware before any of the other family that there had been a crash and that my uncle was on the airplane. But in addition to that, the crew chief who was scheduled to have been on the flight, instead of Frank, came to visit my grandparents and told them the story of what had happened. His sisters loved him because he was so playful, and he was one of the favorites of the family because he was so fun-loving. It was a family loss that no one ever got over.
Before he leaves America, Garth wants to try and understand why the Bakers Creek crash has left such a lasting legacy. At the gates of the Arlington National Cemetery in the USA is the Bakers Creek Memorial, which lists the names of all the young men who died. sitting atop a slab of pink Queensland granite, specially imported from Australia. It's a proud monument resting in one of the most revered locations in the United States, and a powerful reminder that the men who died at Baker's Creek were part of US General Douglas MacArthur's successful defense of Australia against the Japanese.
The war at that stage was only just over the hump, if you like, of real fear in the country that they faced an invasion. So it was in the aftermath of 1942, which had been our year of living dangerously, when Japanese advance got well into New Guinea and Australian forces were fighting with their backs to the wall and to a fair degree alone. This little group of soldiers of a whole variety of disciplines, if you like, from infantry through to air support, were part of the early phase, if you like, of American commitment to Australia and to the defence of Australia.
And so Baker's Creek is another symbol of the sacrifice that both nations have made for each other. It's a symbol of the commitment that the United States made to protecting a weaker nation such as Australia. And Australians, we just don't forget. You know, we don't forget our friends.
By June 1943, more than 120,000 US servicemen were operating under MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific Theatre. But what were the 35 men who died at Baker's Creek doing in Mackay? Following a devastating cyclone in 1915, Mackay had been completely redeveloped. The new buildings and infrastructure and the temperate and malaria-free climate convinced the US authorities to use Mackay as a rest and recuperation centre for their war-weary men. Speaking in front of Maguire's Hotel, where many of those on the Baker's Creek B-17 spent their last few days, local historian Berenice Wright explains what the townsfolk of Mackay thought of their friendly invaders.
They loved them because they were very smart for a start. People had a Hollywoodian idea of what Americans looked like, and they certainly lived up to the image.
What entertainment was available to the Americans?
There was a lot of entertainment available for them. For instance, each day in the paper they would publish a list of entertainments for the day. It was a column called What's Cookin' at the ARC, the American Red Cross. And what was cooking were bus rides to Imeo. They could hire horses, they could hire bicycles and ride around the city. They just gave a different aspect. I think that... I get emotional, sorry.
That's okay.
I think that people felt that they could do something for these young fellows, as probably was being done for many of their sons overseas too. It was a reciprocation, really.
The war was a knife fight, and it was a really awful environment, hard, tough, tropical climate. Leave was critical. So these guys, you can imagine it, they'd have been in the worst conditions that anyone could be in. They've gone back to Australia. They've had some leave. They've been collected together, put on the plane, and then that accident happens.
The horror of the B-17 crash brought a previously remote war home to the people of Mackay. They watched the US military authorities throw a cloak of secrecy over what had happened. Local people were told in no uncertain terms to keep quiet about the crash. The heavy-handed censorship seemed designed to simply wipe it from the records.
Generally speaking, the hush-up was not to cover a mess-up. Generally speaking, it was a morale-related issue. And I guess the thought of 40, it's a large number, of 40 men going down, being killed in these circumstances after they'd been on leave, going back to the battlefront from which they'd come. It's not the sort of story that necessarily boosts morale.
With so few official records of the disaster, can the crash site itself yield any clues? It lies 5 miles south of Mackay, and Garth meets local historian Col Benson there.
Where are we? Is this the crash site here?
Yeah, this is a crash site here where the fuselage came to rest. It took off from over there in a northeasterly direction from where we were. That's Mackay Airport. Then it headed southwest. It took off southwest and did 2 U-turns and then virtually came down through here, where it came down through the path and gradually lost altitude from a couple of 100 feet and crashed through the trees and into this area here. Came in at a shallow angle. It didn't nosedive in, and once it hit the ground, of course, it was fully laden with fuel for a 4-hour trip to Port Moresby. The tail section seems to have leapt over the top of the main wreckage and appears over here, somewhere to my right. And that's where the survivor was found, in that tail section with others who are deceased. We only have 2 or 3 photographs of it, and it seems that the wreckage, there's not much wreckage shown there, but it ends with a timbered area, as though it was those mangroves over there. So I think we're in the general area as to where it came to rest, determined as best as we can.
A 1947 aerial survey photo confirms the exact location, as the shape of the impact left by the plane can be clearly seen on the terrain.
And with the wreckage so spread out, it would appear he came in low and flat rather than at an angle?
Yes, it seems like it came in low and flat, and we've got a couple of descriptions of that. A young boy at the time was 14, and he described how he'd come from the creek and suddenly realised he was in the glide path of it as it came, as the trees gradually got closer and closer to the ground, that they'd been chopped off by the aircraft coming down to ground.
The evidence from the crash site seems to suggest that the plane made a controlled descent to the ground. While conducting his own research, Col Benson discovered a 1943 Australian police report on the crash. As it was wartime, the police were asked to investigate the possibility that the plane was sabotaged, but this was conclusively ruled out. Can this, the only official report of any kind on the B-17 crash, give Garth any more clues?
There's lots of interesting pieces of evidence within the report that give us a clearer picture of actually what went on. And the bit that's caught my eye is they were actually given the cause of the crash.
The report offers the opinion of the officer in charge of US Aviation at Mackay, Lieutenant Neighbours.
Neighbours seems to place the blame on the pilot. As the report states, he considers that the accident was due to the pilot's banking the plane at insufficient altitude, the latter being possibly prevented by the fog from observing the nearness of the ground. The only problem I have with taking this at face value is there's a bit of conjecture on Neighbours' part. He states earlier in the report that the fog limited his visibility and he was only following the plane by its lights. He was 5 miles away, so he would never have been able to be certain of the cause.
The report seems to rule out engine problems, and 3 witnesses all said they could see no flames coming from the plane or anything that indicated it was in difficulties. And Garth finds another intriguing clue.
A number of the witnesses agree that the plane was brightly illuminated, like he had his landing lights on. But why? If Neighbours' account is to be believed, then surely the pilot knew what height it was at, so he wouldn't have needed to put his lights on. Or maybe it was a sign that he knew he was in trouble and he just put the lights on to signal, maybe. The report states it was foggier at the crash site, certainly foggier than what it was on the airfield, so maybe he was using the lights to find somewhere to put down.
For many years, the pilot Vern Gidcombe was the man thought to be responsible for the accident. It's easy to see why. Gidcombe had only just taken over the plane from another much more experienced pilot who had returned to the United States. A young, inexperienced pilot loses control of an aircraft. Case closed. But were the conclusions drawn by Lieutenant Neighbours and others at the base the main reason Gidcombe got the blame? It's possible, but to Garth, the report indicates that Gidcombe was fighting a problem on board. Gidcombe's B-17 was one of a number of planes that had been pressed into service as air transport of the Allied Air Forces. The B-17's reuse was a makeshift solution to a simple problem of resources.
Very early on in America's role in the war, the troop carrier groups and the transport units really had to use a bit of a hodgepodge of aircraft. The transport units were kind of right at the very end of the supply chain without all the support of the infrastructure that you would get on the mainland USA. So inevitably they were forced to sort of make do and mend a bit, and there are plenty of documented accounts of aircraft being severely battle damaged, being shot up and being patched up and patched up and patched again just to keep them flying. Now inevitably, if you do that, you're going to suffer losses, you're going to suffer problems, big reliability problems.
The plane had been worked hard for the previous year in a role for which it was not designed. It was the perfect example of the make-do-and-mend attitude to the needs of wartime transport. And that brought problems, so was a mechanical issue at the root of the crash.
This B-17 had been grounded at the end of May for an engine replacement. They put in a refurbished engine. That one failed during a test. They put another refurbished engine in, and that engine also failed. Eventually, the general in the Air Transport Command instructed that a new engine should be fitted, and everything went fine once that happened.
Jeff Cunningham, a Mackay schoolboy at the time, remembers watching the plane flight testing the new engines just 2 days before the accident.
What took our attention this particular Friday that we heard it flying around was that the motors didn't sound as though they were synchronised. You get this variation in sound if they're not synchronised properly, and it appeared to us as children that the motor was missing a little bit, or one of them was missing.
Perhaps these replacement engines were to blame. Garth's determined to try and piece together the plane's last moments by talking to local witnesses. What can they tell him? Percy Webb was a 15-year-old butcher's delivery boy at the time, and he remembers seeing the B-17 preparing to fly that morning.
I was down there and delivered the meat, and a hell of a row going on down there with the aircraft, the ground crew, or whatever the engine is up. And I could see the flying portals from where I was, and the flames flying out of the back of it, the back bar, you know, a lot of blue smoke around. So that went on for 3 or 4 minutes, and all quietened down.
Percy watched as Gidcombe, Erb, Ogren, Welshel and the others prepared the B-17 for takeoff.
He taxied out on the main runway, went down there, went down to the northeast, southwest runway. He went down there and he took off. There was no planes flying out the back of the motor.
The B-17 continued to climb, but very sluggishly. As the plane rose into a bank of fog, Gidcombe and Erb lost sight of the ground. Did they realise they were too low to make their 2 left turns back to the airfield? The police report indicated that Gidcombe realised the danger he was in, because in an attempt to penetrate the mist and fog, he turned the plane's landing lights on. The B-17 now made its second turn to line itself up on a direct course for home. A young Ivan Bragg lived with his parents in a house next door to Baker's Creek. He remembers being woken up as the plane thundered just a few metres above his home.
I was asleep in bed at the time, and I heard the noise crash and looked out the window, and here's this big flash. It was pretty close. It could have hit the houses.
Ivan's father, Arnold, was one of the first men to reach the crash site.
There was 2 men that he seen that were alive. One was walking around in a daze, and he took that person down to the gate to a lady named Mrs. Harris, and she looked after him for that period. Then he come back, and he tried to find the bloke that was jumping around. And he said there was legs and arms and everywhere, and people strung up in trees and burnt bodies.
Sadly, one of the 2 men Arnold Bragg tried to save died before reaching hospital, but the other, Corporal Foy K. Roberts, had had an amazing escape. Emerging from the wreckage with only superficial injuries, it's thought that he survived because he was cushioned from the impact by the bodies of his comrades. Rudy Sabo was a local farm worker. After hearing the plane come down, he and his fellow workers rushed to the crash site, where they were confronted by the terrible scene.
There was a few arms and legs stretched across. Then, of course, I went and had a look at the fuselage, and that's where I seen the bodies. They were all lying head backwards, all facing one way down the tail. 36 of them, about. They were all stacked. I don't know how anybody down the bottom could have lived anyway. All a big, like 2 football teams and not a murmur. It frightened me, you know? See that many young men, not a murmur. I came home and I said to Mum, "You smell anything, Mum?" She said, "No." I said, "Wash my clothes, I can smell dead men." I went to bed that night, I could still smell it. It wasn't my clothes at all, it was my bloody head.
Amid the wreckage, Rudy spotted something that gives Garth another clue.
The Yanks loved it. They love